The padlock had been hanging on that door since before I was born, and it was warm in my palm now because I had been holding it too long, turning it over, not turning the key. My father stood one step below me on the iron stairs, close enough that I could hear him breathing. The stairs ran up the back of the snack bar to the projection booth, and they had rusted to the color of old blood, and every one of them complained under our weight. Above us the booth sat squat and square against the sky going purple at the edges. One small window faced the field. The glass had gone milky with 40 years of dust and dead moths, and you could not see a single thing through it. That was the point, I think. Nobody had seen inside that room since 1985. I was 36 years old, and I had grown up on this property, run barefoot across this gravel, sold popcorn from that snack bar window as a girl, and I had never once been inside the projection booth. None of us had. My grandfather locked it the autumn my grandmother died, screwed the door frame tight, hung this brass padlock, and went home, and he never came back up these stairs as long as he lived. My mother kept the key in a cigar box in her dresser, and never used it either. 3 weeks ago, my mother died. Now, the key was in my hand, and the Comet Drive-In belonged to my father and me, and a man we were related to by blood was doing everything in his power to take it away from us before he could find out what my grandfather had hidden up here for 4 decades. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why my father and I were standing on those stairs at dusk, refusing to look at each other, you have to go back, not 40 years, just 3 weeks, to the morning my mother stopped being alive. Her name was Nell Hatcher, born Nell Vaughn, and she died in the back bedroom of the little house on Summer Street with my father holding one hand and me holding the other, and the window open because she had asked for the window open. It was the first warm morning of April. You could hear a lawnmower somewhere down the block and a mourning dove on the wire, and my mother took a breath that did not lead to another one, and that was the end of 66 years of her. My father did not make a sound. He sat there a long time with her hand in both of his, rubbing his thumb across her knuckles the way he had done at the kitchen table for 40 years of marriage, without either of them ever seeming to notice they were doing it. Then he stood up, and he straightened the blanket over her, and he said, "I'll put the coffee on." That was Gil Hatcher. When the worst thing in the world arrived, my father put the coffee on, because the kettle was something he could still do something about. People in Harmon, Ohio, did not think much of my father. I learned that young, the way you learn the layout of your own house, without anyone ever sitting you down to explain it. He was a projectionist. He had been the projectionist at the Comet since he was 17, a skinny kid my grandfather hired to run the Carbon Arts on summer nights. And when my grandfather's daughter started bringing him lemonade up the stairs and lingering, my grandfather did not chase him off. He let it happen. So my father married into the Vaughn family, married into the drive-in, and to a certain kind of person in that town that made him a man who had inherited a weed lot by accident of romance. He never had a fancy job. He fixed engines at the implement dealer for years, and when that closed, he drove a delivery route. And on the side, always, every season of his life, he took care of the Comet, and the Comet did not pay him. It had not shown a film since 1985. The screen still stood at the north end of the property, a great white wall of weathered plywood on a steel frame, 60 feet of it facing a field of speaker poles that no longer held speakers. The snack bar roof leaked. The marquee out on Old State Route 9 had lost half its red plastic letters. So for most of my childhood it read the See Me, and the local kids called it that as a joke, the Comey, like it was a person. My father mowed the ramps anyway, those long curved earthen ramps where the cars used to park nose up toward the screen. He kept them mowed for 30 years, so they would not disappear into the brush. He patched the screen when the wind tore it. He greased the gate hinges. People drove past on Route 9 and saw a man in his 60s cutting grass at a dead drive-in, and they shook their heads, and some of them said, not always behind his back, that Gil Hatcher was a caretaker of a graveyard. I understood the land was worth money. Everyone understood that. The county had finally built the bypass 2 years back, and where the bypass met Route 9, a developer had thrown up a shopping plaza with a grocery and a drugstore and a drive-through bank, and suddenly the 14 acres of the Comet, which had been worth nothing my whole life, sat at the most valuable corner in the township. Surveyors came around. We started getting letters from a company called Branslow Development. Thick envelopes with glossy, folded pages inside, and my mother threw them in the wood stove without opening them. My father said the land would do what the land would do after he was gone, but while he was breathing, the comet was not for sale. My grandfather was named Walter Vaughn. Everybody called him Walt. He came back from Korea in 1953 with a little money and a head full of light, and he bought a flat 14 acres outside Harmon and built a drive-in theater with his own hands and the hands of two cousins. He poured the ramps. He raised a screen tower. He wired 300 speaker poles by himself across 2 summers. He named it the Comet because the summer he opened it there had been a comet you could see from the field, a smear of coal fire low in the west after the second feature, and people would sit on their car hoods and watch the sky after the movie ended and not want to go home. My grandfather used to say the Comet had picked a name, and he was only the fellow who painted it on the sign. He married my grandmother, Ruth, in 1955. She ran the snack bar and the ticket booth and the books, and from everything I was ever told, she ran my grandfather, too, with a soft hand he was glad to be run by. They had 2 children, my mother, Nell, the younger one, and her brother, my uncle, Dale. I need to tell you about Dale Vaughn, because Dale is the reason this story has the shape it has. Dale was the older child, the son, and Walt expected the son to love the comet the way Walt loved it. Dale did not. Dale grew up at a drive-in and hated the smell of popcorn oil and the sound of crickets and the way the whole rhythm of his family's life ran backward from everyone else's, awake all night and asleep all morning, broke in winter and frantic in summer. He wanted hard floors and air conditioning, and a clean white shirt that did not smell like the snack bar by 10 o'clock. He left for Columbus the week he turned 20 in 1971, and he got into real estate, and he was good at it. And over the years, he became the kind of man whose face is on a bus bench. Commercial property, land assembly. He had a way of standing in a room that told you he had already decided what the room was worth and was only waiting for you to catch up. There was a deeper wound and restlessness, though, and I did not understand it for most of my life. In the spring of 1985, my grandmother Ruth got sick. It was in her stomach, and it moved fast, and it was ugly, and it took her in 5 months. My mother, who was 19, never left her side. My father, who was already around by then, drove Ruth to her treatments in Columbus when Walt could not bear to. And Dale, who was living an hour away in that same city, who could have come, did not come. He was closing the biggest deal of his young life that summer, an office park out near the airport. And he told his father over the telephone that he could not get away. And then he did not get away, not for the long, slow dying, and not, in the end, for the funeral. He drove down 2 days after they buried her in a gray suit and stood at the edge of the cemetery and left before the casseroles were cold. My grandfather did not speak to his son again for 11 years. And the night they buried Ruth, Walt went up to the projection booth alone, and he locked it, and the comet went dark, and it stayed dark for the rest of all our lives. That was the place I was standing with the key in my hand. That was the door. My mother's funeral was on a Saturday. Dale came to it. I will give him that much. He came in a charcoal suit that fit him the way money fits a man, and he hugged my father stiffly at the door of the funeral home, and he held my hands in both his and told me my mother had been the best of all of them, which was true, and he said it in a voice that was already, somewhere underneath, doing arithmetic. He waited 4 days. For days after we put my mother in the ground next to Ruth, Dale called my father and asked to meet at the lawyer's office in town to go over this state. My father did not have a lawyer. The Vaughns had used the same man for 50 years, Harlan Pruitt, who was 81 now and mostly retired, but still kept an office above the hardware store with his name on the frosted glass. Dale had been the one to call the meeting. Dale had brought his own attorney from Columbus, a young man named Reese in a slim suit with a leather folio, and Dale had brought one more person, who he introduced as Garrett Sloan of Branch Sloan Development, as though we should be honored. I will never forget that room. Harlan Pruitt's office smelled like pipe smoke and old paper and the radiator. There were 8 of us crowded around a table built for 4. My father wore his good flannel shirt, the green one, and he had cut himself shaving, a little nick under his jaw, and I kept looking at it and wanted to cry about a thing that had nothing to do with anything. Dale ran the meeting before Harlan could open his mouth. "Here's where we are," Dale said, and he laid one hand flat on the table. Mom and Dad left the Comet property jointly. When Dad passed, it went to Nell, and now that Nell's gone, it comes back into the family estate. I'm Nell's only sibling, by any reasonable reading. Gil and Frankie hold Nell's interest, and I hold mine through Dad, and that makes us co-owners. The land's worth a great deal of money now. Garrett's people are prepared to make a strong offer for the whole parcel. The smart, clean thing is a sale. Everybody walks away with more than they've ever had. He looked at my father when he said the smart thing. He looked at my father the way you look at a slow horse. My father did not answer right away. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the saucer. Then he said, "Walt left the Comet to Nell. Dad was an old man who didn't keep records." Dale said, "There's no clean paper. I checked. I had Reese pull everything at the county. There's the original deed to Walt Vaughn from 1953, and then there's a recorded transfer into Walt and Ruth jointly. And after that, the file is a mess. Half of it burned in the courthouse fire in '04. There's no clean instrument. That cuts me out. And the law doesn't let one heir just decide. So," he spread his hands like a man being reasonable, "we sell. We split it fair. I'm not trying to take anything from you. Gil, I'm trying to get you out from under a money pit before it bankrupts you. You're 68 years old, mowing a field that's killing your back, for a movie theater that's been dead longer than your daughter's been alive." He smiled when he said it. That was the part one could not forgive. He smiled at his own line, pleased with it, in front of his lawyer and his developer, and Garrett Sloan gave a small chuckle, the kind of chuckle a man gives when his client makes a joke he is being paid to find funny. My father's face did not change. He looked at Dale across that table for a long moment, and then he said something I've thought about every day since. "You were never up in the booth," my father said. "What?" Dale said. "The projection booth. You never set foot in it. Even as a boy, you hated it up there. Walt used to say you were the only Vaughn the Light never got into." My father stood up and put his hat on. "I'll think about your offer, Dale. Frankie and I have got affairs to settle first. We got the key to that booth now, and I expect we'll be opening it. 40 years it's been waiting on somebody. Seems wrong to sell the ground out from under it before we even know what your father left inside." I watched Dale's face when my father said the word key. I have replayed it 100 times. For half a second, before he put his salesman smile back on, Dale Vaughn looked afraid. We drove home my father's truck without the radio on. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his jaw set, and at a stop sign on the edge of town, he said, mostly to the windshield, "He's lying about something. I've known that man 50 years, and I've never seen him lie about money. He's too good at money to need to lie about it." He pulled away from the sign. "He's lying about something else." Here is what I had not told my father yet, because I was waiting for a moment that would not hurt him. And there is no such moment after your wife dies. The morning after the funeral, I had been cleaning out my mother's dresser, the small one with the spotted mirror, and in the bottom drawer under the church gloves she never wore I found the cigar box. King Edward Imperial, the lid soft with handling. Inside was the brass key, heavy and dark, and a single sheet of stationery folded in thirds, and on it my mother's handwriting, which had gone shaky her last year, but was still hers. It said, "Frankie, I always meant open it with your father, and I never could. After Daddy died, I just couldn't face going up there. Your grandfather left the rest of it in the booth. The deed and the films and his reasons. Take Gil with you. He'll know what to do with the machines. Don't let Dale near it first. I love you both more than the whole sky. Mom, the rest of it in the booth. The deed and the films and his reasons." I had carried that note in my coat for 3 days, and at the stop sign on the edge of Harmon, I took it out and read it to my father while he drove, and he had to pull onto the gravel shoulder because his eyes filled up and he could not see the road. He read it himself twice. Then he folded it back along my mother's folds, careful, like the paper was a living thing, and he said, "Tomorrow. We'll go up tomorrow in the light." But we did not get to do it the easy way, because that night Dale moved first. Around 8 o'clock, a Brant Sloan truck and 2 other vehicles turned in at the Comet Gate. I know because old Sal Farrow called us. Sal had run the second projector at the Comet back in the 70s, learned the trade at my grandfather's elbow, and he lived now in a trailer on the parcel across the road, a half-deaf widower of 80 who watched the drive-in the way some men watch a river. Sal called the house and said, "Gil, there's men with flashlights up at your snack bar, and one of them's got a bolt cutter." My father did not say a word. He got his coat and the truck keys, and he was gone, and I was right behind him in my own car. We came up Route 9 with our headlights cutting across the field, and there in the beams were 3 men at the foot of the booth stairs, and Dale Vaughn standing among them in a windbreaker over his good shirt, and one of Sloane's men holding a long-handled bolt cutter against my grandfather's padlock. My father did not get out of the truck slow. For a man with a bad back, he came out of that cab like he was 30, and he crossed the gravel, and he put himself between the bolt cutter and the stairs, and he said, "Get off my property." "Our property," Dale said, but his voice had a crack in it. "Show me the paper that says it's yours." My father said, "You stood in Harlan's office this afternoon and told me there's no clean instrument. That door's not yours to cut. And if you put a tool to my father-in-law's lock tonight, in the dark with hired men, I will have the sheriff out here so fast it'll make your office park spin." So I come across the road in his slippers with a flashlight of his own, and he stood next to my father, all 5.5 feet of him, and somewhere in the dark a dog was barking, and for a long moment nobody moved. Then Dale told his men to put the cutter away. He looked at my father, and the salesman was gone out of his face entirely, and what was left was just a frightened old man in a windbreaker who did not want anyone going into a room his own father had sealed 40 years ago. "You don't know what's up there," Dale said. It was almost a plea. "No," my father said, "but I'm going to." They left. We stood in the field listening to their taillights go small on Route 9. And my father turned to me, and the moon was up by then over the dead screen, and he said, "Tomorrow won't do. We open it now. Frankie, tonight, before that man finds a judge or a lie that works." He looked up at the booth window, milky and blind. "I'm not afraid of what's up there. I'm afraid of what he'll do if he gets to it before we do." So we climbed the stairs. Sal stayed at the bottom with his flashlight pointed up, and my father went first, and I came behind with the brass key warm in my hand from holding it too long, which is where this story started, on that rusted iron landing at the door that had not opened since the year my grandmother died. The key did not want to turn. 40 years of weather had glued the works of that padlock into a single rusted lump, and my father had to take it down and work oil into it from a little kid he kept in the truck for the gate hinges. And we stood up there a half hour in the dark while the oil did its work and the cicadas sawed away in the grass. When the shackle finally let go, it made a sound like a hell breath being let out, but the lock was only the half of it. My grandfather had also driven 4 long with screws through the door into the jamb, sealing it the way you seal a thing you mean to stay sealed, and my father took them out one at a time with a screwdriver, slow, because 3 of them had rusted, and the heads were soft, and the last one he had to drill out entirely. Then there was nothing holding the door but the door, and we stood in front of it, my father and I, and neither of us reached for the handle. "Your grandmother used to sit up here with him on the slow nights," my father said. His voice had gone low and rough. "Ruth, she'd bring a thermos, and the 2 of them would sit in that little room with the films running and watch the field fill up with cars. She told me once it was the only place Walt ever sat still." He put his hand flat on the door. "He didn't lock this because he was hiding money, Frankie. He locked it because she was in here, as much of her as he had left. He opened the door. The smell came out at us first, and I will carry that smell to my own grave. Dust and mildew and the Swedish chemical bite of old film stock, vinegar, and something like almonds, and underneath all of it the ghost of popcorn oil soaked into wood for 30 years. Sal's flashlight from below, through our shadows, huge across the far wall. My father found the switch by memory, and miracle of miracles the power still ran to Booth. Fed off the snack bar line he'd kept live all those years with a well pump, and a single bare bulb came on overhead and showed us the room. 2 projectors stood side by side in the middle of the floor, great black simplex machines on iron pedestals. Their carbon arc lamp houses humped behind them like the heads of patient animals. They were furred gray with dust an inch thick. The little window to the field was choked with the bodies of every moth that had ever beaten itself against the glass. Along the back wall ran steel shelving, and on the shelves, in their flat round cans, stood the films. Hundreds of them, each can labeled in my grandfather's square hand on strips of masking tape gone amber with age. And in the corner, under a canvas tarp, something boxy and waist-high that turned out, when my father lifted the canvas, to be a green steel cabinet with a combination dial set into the door. But that was not what stopped us. What stopped us was a chair. My grandfather's chair was pulled up to the editing bench under the field window, an old wooden swivel chair with a cushion gone to dust, and on the bench in front of it, laid out the way a man lays out the things he once found, were 3 objects. A film can, set apart from all the others, with a strip of tape that read, in his hand, "For whoever opens this." A leather portfolio, cracked and dry, and my grandmother's reading glasses, folded, with one lens cracked clean across, exactly where she must have set them down one ordinary night 40 years ago, never know it was the last one. My father sat down in his chair, not in Walt's chair. He pulled over the bench stool and he sat, and he picked up Ruth's broken glasses and held them in his big grease-scarred hands, and he wept the way I had not seen him weep at the funeral, the way a man weeps when the dam he built finally goes. I let him. I went to the shelves with Sal's borrowed flashlight, and I read the labels on the films while my father cried behind me, because I did not know what else to do with my own grief, and reading was something I could do. The labels were not movie titles, or not only. There were a few of those, old westerns and a Hitchcock, and reels marked trailers 1962 and newsreel Korea. But most of the cans had dates. Ruth and the Kids, Easter 1961. Nell First Day School, 1971. Opening Night 1953. Comet, Last Good Summer 1984. My grandfather had been filming his own life for 30 years. Home movies, shot on a 16mm camera, developed and edited and stored in this room like the reels of any picture he ever ran for the public and never shown to a soul. A whole family, a whole drive-in, a whole vanished world, sitting in cans in the dark since before I was born. And then I found the one that made my hand stop. I can near the end of the bottom shelf. The tape newer than the rest, the ink darker. It read, "Deed and papers. If Dale comes, give T.O. Harlan." If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. I brought that into my father. He set down Ruth's glasses and opened it, and inside there was no film. Inside was a sealed envelope, brittle and yellowed, with a wax button pressed over the flap, and across the front in my grandfather's square print, "T.O.B. open in the presence of Harlan Pruitt, ATDY." We did not open it. My father held it a long while, and then he said, "Your grandfather thought of everything. He left the legal part for the lawyer and the rest for us." He looked at the green steel cabinet with the combination dial, but I'll bet the cabinet's not locked against us. He turned the dial to a date I did not recognize at first. For numbers, then 2 more. The day Walt married Ruth. 8/28/55. The cabinet opened on the first try. What was inside the cabinet was the answer to everything, but we did not understand all of it that night. There were ledgers, the green cloth account books of the drive-in going back to 1953. Every season's taken my grandmother's bookkeeping hand. There was a fat folder of original documents, the real deed, the survey, the tax stamps, and clipped to the front of that folder, by itself, a single notarized page that my father read 3 times by flashlight before he understood it. And when he understood it, he laughed. One short bark of a laugh that had grief and triumph mixed in it so thick I could not tell which was which. It was a quitclaim deed, dated September 1984. In it, Dale Allen Vaughn, for valuable consideration received, surrendered, released, and forever quit any and all claim, present or future, to the real property known as the Comet Drive-In and all 14 acres thereof, in favor of his father Walter Vaughn, his sole intent being to receive his portion of the family's worth in cash, then and there, with no further interest in the land. It was signed in Dale's own hand. It was witnessed. It was notarized by a notary in Columbus whose stamp was still crisp on the page. And clipped behind it was a canceled bank draft payable to Dale Vaughn in the amount of $40,000, which in 1984 was the price of a house, and which, the ledger told us when we found the entry, was the seed money Dale had used to start the company that put his face on a bus bench. He had taken his inheritance. He had taken it in cash, at his own asking, the year before his mother died, while his father was still pouring everything into a failing drive-in to keep the lights on for the wife who was sick. He had taken the money and signed away the land, and then he had abandoned the family in their worst year. And now, 40 years later, with his sister and his father in the ground and the corner suddenly worth millions, he had come back betting that the proof was gone. He had told us himself, in the lawyer's office, that the courthouse fire had burned half the records. He was not lying about that. He was lying about not knowing what it meant. He had checked. He had pulled everything at the county and found no recorded copy of the quitclaim, and he had decided that the only signed original in the world was either destroyed or lost, and he had built his whole play on that bet. He had forgotten, or never known, that Walt Vaughn put the most important things in the booth. My father sat in that dusty light with the quitclaim in his hand, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, 40 years he kept this. He could have recorded it and been done. He could have shamed Dale with it. He never did. He just kept it up here, where his son would never go, and he trusted it'd find the right hand someday. He set it back in the folder, gentle. Nell knew. She had to have known. That's why she said, don't let Dale near it first. We did not sell the Comet. I want to put that plainly, because of where this is going. We did not sell it, and Dale did not get a dime. But neither of those is the thing my father cared about, and by the end it was not the thing I cared about either. We took the sealed envelope to Harlan Pruitt the next morning, and we took the folder, and we sat in that pipe smoke office while the old lawyer broke the wax button with a thumbnail and read my grandfather's letter through his thick glasses, his lips moving a little. When he finished, he took the glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and he said, well, Walt always was 3 moves ahead of everybody who underestimated him, and most everybody did. He laid the quitclaim flat on the blotter. This is good. This is airtight. Notarized original. Executed for consideration. The consideration documented in the ledger and the bank draft. Dale Vaughn has no more claim to that ground than I do. He sold it to his father in 1984 and spent the money. He looked up at my father. He knows it, Gil. A man who pulls every record the county knows exactly what he's gambling on. He was gambling this paper didn't survive. Harlan called Dale himself that afternoon and asked him to come to the office Friday. He did not tell him why. He only said the estate had a document Dale would want to see in person. And then Harlan did something I did not expect. He asked us to bring a projector and a screen, because the rest of the booth, you understand, was not legal papers. The rest of the booth was 30 years of my family, sitting in cans in the dark. And my father, who had run Carbon Arc since he was 17, looked at those 2 filthy simplex machines and said he could have one of them running by Friday if I helped him clean it. And Harlan said an odd thing then for a lawyer. He said, show Dale the paper, yes, but show him the films first. A man can argue with a paper. I've never seen one argue with his own mother's face. Sal Farrow came and helped us. The 3 of us spent 2 days in that booth with rags and solvent and compressed air, and slowly one of the projectors came back to itself under our hands. The dust coming off in gray sheets to show black enamel underneath, the gate cleaned, the sprockets oiled. The lamp swapped for a modern bulb, because nobody was going to mess with carbon arcs in this day and age. Sal threaded a test reel with hands that shook a little, and my father killed a bare bulb, and the machine clattered to life with that sound I had not heard in my whole life, but recognized somewhere under my ribs anyway. The soft machine gun rattle filmed through a gate, and a square of white light leaped out the clean window and across the dark field, and struck the old screen 60 feet away. And for the first time since 1985, there was a picture on the Comet screen. It was only the test reel, a few feet of some forgotten coming attraction, scratched and faded. But Sal Farrow sat down on the booth floor like his legs had quit, and my father stood at the window watching the light cross the field he had mowed for 30 years for no reason he could ever name to anyone, and he said, there it is. There's the reason. He had never been able to say why he kept the place alive. I think that was the night he found out. We did not run the home movies until Friday. It felt right to wait, to let Dale see them when we did. All of us at once, the way Walt would have wanted, with the picture on the big screen and the family in the field. Harlan handled it. He told Dale to come to the common at dusk on Friday for the resolution of the estate. And he told him to come alone. And Dale, who must have sensed by then that the ground had shifted under him, came alone. I will tell you exactly how it happened, because it is the part one least want to forget. It was a clear evening, the second week of April, the air just barely warm. My father had set up folding chairs in the field below the screen, a dozen of them, because word had gotten around Harmon the way word does, and people had come. Sal, of course, Harlan Pruitt in his Sunday hat, some of the old families who had courted in that field and raised their kids on those ramps, a woman named Teresa Lim, who I had called that week on a hunch and who had driven 3 hours from a film archive at the State University, because when I described what was on the shelves of that booth, the dates, the home movies, the cans marked Newsreel Korea, and the studio prints, her voice had changed, and she had said, very carefully, "Frankie, please don't move anything until I get there." More on her in a moment. Dale arrived at dusk in his good car. He got out and stood at the edge of the gravel, taking in the chairs and the people, and the screen lit faintly by the last of the day, and I watched him understand that this was not going to be a meeting in a quiet office. My father walked over to him. They stood a few feet apart in the field where they had both been young men, and my father said, not unkindly, "Sit down, Dale. There's some things your father left that you ought to see." We ran the films. My father was in the booth. I sat in the field next to Harlan with the legal folder on my lap. And the light came across the dark, and the first reel was opening night 1953. And there on the great white screen was my grandfather at 26, impossibly young in shirt sleeves, painting the word comment on a board with a brush, turning to grin at the camera, mugging, holding up the brush like a trophy. The field made a sound, a soft collective intake of breath, because half the people in those chairs had known that young man as an old one, and some had buried him. Then Ruth and the kids, Easter 1961, and there was my grandmother, Ruth Vaughn, alive, in a yellow dress, laughing at whoever held the camera, herding 2 small children across the gravel in their church clothes. The girl was my mother at 3 or 4, and the boy, the older one, scowling in a clip-on tie, refusing to look at the lens, was Dale. I heard him then. From 3 chairs down in the dark, I heard my uncle make a sound I had never heard a grown man make, a kind of broken inhale, and I turned and saw Garrett Sloan's client, the man with his face on a bus bench, the man who had brought a bolt cutter to his father's door, sitting with both hands pressed over his mouth and his shoulders shaking, watching his mother be young and alive on a 60-foot screen for the first time in 40 years. The films ran on. Summers and Christmases and a flood in '69 that filled the front ramps and the whole town turning out with sandbags. My mother growing up in jump cuts, gap-toothed at the braces to a tall girl in a snack bar apron. And the cars, always the cars, the field filling up night after night across the decades, headlights coming up Route 9, families, lovers, kids in pajamas asleep in back seats, all of it caught and kept by a man who never told anyone he was keeping it. And then my father ran the last reel, the one marked for whoever opens this. It was not home movies. It was Walt himself, alone in the booth, filming into a mirror so the camera would catch his own face. He was old in it, older than I remembered him, which meant he had made it near the end. He sat in his chair under the field window, and he looked into the lens. And when he spoke, the archive woman had warned us the optical sound on these home reels might be too far gone to recover. But my father had cleaned the sound head with his own hands, and it came through, scratchy and thin, and unmistakably my grandfather, out across the dark field to all of us. "If you're watching this," Walt said, "then somebody finally got the door open, and I'm gone, and I'm glad it's done. I locked this room the night we buried Ruth, because I could not stand to be in it without her, and could not stand to let anybody else be in it at all. That was selfish. A man's allowed a little selfishness at the end of a long marriage, I figure." He smiled a little, that crooked Vaughn smile I had just watched come up on a screen 60 years younger. "Nell, if it's you watching, it's all yours, baby, the ground and the films and whatever's in the cabinet. You're the one who stayed. You and that Hatcher boy you married, the one who never could keep his hands off my projectors. Gil, you hear me. You take care of this place or let it go, however your heart tells you, but don't you let anybody shame you about it. You love my daughter and you love this field, and that's 2 more things than most men manage in a life." My father, up in the booth, made a sound through the open window. I heard it carry down. And then my grandfather looked into the camera, and his face changed, and he said, "Dale, if you come back, son, and I expect you have, because the corner's gone and got valuable, and you always didn't know the worth of a corner. I want you to hear me say this where you can't argue with me, because the dead get the last word. That's the one mercy of dying." He took a breath. "You took your 40,084, and you signed the paper, and that was your right. I never held the money against you. Money's just money. What I held against you was that your mother asked for you that last summer, and you sent a deal in your place. You weren't here. And I was so angry at you for not being here that I let it cost us 11 years. And that was my sin as much as yours, because I'm the father and I should have called first." His voice broke and held. "I forgive you, Dale. I forgave you a long time before I made this. I just never could find the door to say it through. So I'm saying it through this one. Come back to the field. Son, not for the money. There's no money in this for you. You sold your share. You know you did. Come back, because your mother's young and laughing on every foot film in this room, and you ought to get to see her. That's all I wanted. That's all I ever wanted. The rest of it, the law and the land, Harlan will sort it. This part's just from your father." The reel ran out. The white light hung empty on the screen, and the machine clattered to its end and went silent, and there was no sound in that field but the cicadas and one man, my uncle, weeping into his hands like the whole 40 years had come due at once. He did not argue about the deed. Harlan walked over to him in the dark with the folder, and Dale waved it away before the old lawyer could even open it. "I know what it says. He managed. I knew what it said when I walked into your office Monday, Harlan. I knew there had been a quitclaim. I just bet my whole life it was gone." He wiped his face with the heel of his hand, a child's gesture in a 60-pound suit. "I told myself I was helping. I told myself Gil was drowning, and I was throwing him a rope. God, help me, I had half believed." He looked up at the booth, where my father stood in the lit window. "He filmed himself, Gil. He sat up there dying, and he filmed himself so he could forgive me through a screen. Who does that? Who in the world does that? Your father?" My father said, "From the booth. That's who did that." It would be a lie to tell you Dale Vaughn was made a new man in a single night. People are not films. They do not resolve in 2 hours. But I will tell you what he did, because what a man does is the only honest measure of him. He did not contest the deed. He paid, out of his own pocket and without being asked, to have the courthouse burned records of the comet reconstructed and properly filed, so that no one could ever again pretend the title was unclear. And on the matter of the land, the corner everyone wanted, he did one more thing. There was a real offer on the table. Garrett Sloan's people would have paid my father and me more money than either of us had ever imagined for those 14 acres, and a drugstore or a self-storage place would have gone up where the screen stood, and nobody in Harmon would have thought us foolish for taking it. My father took a week to decide. He walked the property every evening of that week, and on the last evening I walked it with him. The two of us going up the long grass ramps in the dark, while the new screen light from the test reels flickered against the plywood, and he stopped at the top of the back ramp where you could see the whole field at once, the place his father-in-law had stood the camera for 40 years. Your mother's note said the deed and the films and his reasons. My father said, "We found all three. The reason wasn't money, Frankie. The reason was that he couldn't bear to put the dark over Ruth. 40 years he kept this field mowed in his heart, even after he locked the door. And then I went and kept it mowed with a tractor for 30 more, without ever knowing why, and now I know." He looked at me. "I don't want a drugstore where your grandmother sat with a thermos. I'm too old and too stubborn. And I don't care about the money, but it's half yours. So I'm asking you, not telling, asking. I had a life in the city. I had a job and an apartment, and a man I was not sure about, and the smart, clean thing, as Dale had said in the lawyer's office, was a sale. I stood on the top of that ramp and looked at the dead screen waiting to come back to life, and I thought about my mother saying, 'I love you both more than the whole sky,' and I made the only choice I have never once regretted. 'Let's open it back up,' I said. 'Let's run the comet again.' That was 2 years ago. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen by magic. The thing that made it possible, the thing that turned a romantic notion into a working theater, was Teresa Lim and the films. When she got into that booth with her cotton gloves and her flashlight, she found, among my grandfather's home movies and the old studio prints, 3 reels that made her sit down on the floor much the way Sal had. One was a complete print of a 1955 picture that the studio's own vaults had lost in a fire, a print thought not to exist anywhere on Earth, and the archive wanted it badly enough to pay for it, badly enough to fund a full preservation grant in my grandfather's name. The home movies, all of them, went to the archive to scanned and saved and made part of the permanent record of what life in this country looked like in the back half of a century, an entire vanished world of drive-ins and small towns that Walt Vaughn had been documenting all alone because he loved it and never imagined anyone else would care. The money from the lost print and the grant and a great deal of work rebuilt the snack bar roof and reskinned the screen, and brought a digital projector into the booth to sit beside the clean simplex that my father will not let anyone touch but himself. The Comet reopened on a Friday in June. The marquee out on Route 9 has all its letters now, red against the white, The Comet, and below it, that night it read Opening Night. All welcome. We did not charge admission. My father said the first night back was Walt's night and Ruth's night, and you do not charge a man to come home. The field filled the way it does on the home movies. Headlights coming up the highway in a slow chain, families and old couples and kids in pajamas. For 100 cars on the ramps my father had refused to let the brush take, and we ran a feature off the digital machine. But before the feature, in the booth, my father threaded the clean simplex by hand and ran 1 reel of carbon quality light across the dark. The opening night 1953 reel and 400 carloads of Harmon, Ohio, watched a young man in shirt sleeves paint the word Comet on a board and turn and grin, and the whole field lean on their horns at once, a sound like a flock taking off. And somewhere in the dark, I heard my father laugh in the booth, and I knew he was crying too, because by then I could tell the difference in him, and there is no difference. Dale was there. He sits in the field most Friday nights now, in a folding chair near the front, alone, and he does not make a show of it, and nobody makes a show of him. He had the archive make him copies of every reel his mother's on, and Sal told me he drove out to the cemetery the week after opening night, and sat a long time at Ruth's stone, which he had not visited in 40 years. Since the day he came 2 days late in a gray suit and left before the casseroles were cold. Whatever passed between him, and that stone is his and hers. But he comes to the field now. He came back, the way his father asked him to, not for the money, because there was never any money in it for him, and he knew it, but to see her young and laughing on every foot of film in that room. That is the only forgiveness that was ever my power to offer, and it turned out it was not even mine to offer, because my grandfather had already given it through a screen before I was born. Sal Farrow runs the second projector again. He is 82 and he naps in the booth between reels, and my father lets him, because Sal learned the trade at Walt's elbow, and there is a rightness to it. Teresa Lim brings film students out twice a year to study the booth, which is now, she says, one of the last working carbon-air projection rooms with its original collection intact, a thing worth preserving for its own sake. And my grandfather, who filmed his whole life because he could not stand to let it disappear, has become a small piece of why other people's lives will not disappear either. He would have hated being called important. He would have said he was only the fellow who painted the sign. My father is 70 now. His back is worse and his hands shake a little threading the gate, but he is up in that booth every Friday and Saturday from May to October, in the room where Ruth sat with her thermos. In the chair he will not let me reupholster, because the dust in it is partly her. I asked him once, late, after the field had emptied and we were locking the gate, whether he was sorry we did it, whether the money would have made his last years easier. The two of us out there in the dark with a flashlight the way we had been the night we first opened the door. He thought about it the honest way he thinks about everything. Your mother spent her whole life, he said, knowing what was up in that booth and never being able to face it. She kept the key in a cigar box for 30 years, and it ate at her, the not knowing she'd left it locked, the feeling she let her own father's heart sit up there in the dark. He hung the lock on the gate, the new one, the one that opens easy. We faced it. We got the door open. Everything since then has been the easy part. He looked back across the field at the screen, pale in the moonlight. No, I'm not sorry. A man gets one chance, if he's lucky, to turn the lights back on in the place that made him. Most men don't get the chance. We did. We took it. He started for the truck. Come on, Frankie. It's late, and the dove will be on the wire by the time we get home. The Comet still stands at the corner of the bypass in Old State Route 9, the most valuable ground in the township, with a movie playing on it every weekend night against a sky that fills with stars once the second feature ends. People sit on their car hoods after and look up. There is no Comet anymore. There has not been one since 1953. But the field fills and the light crosses the dark, and a door that was locked for 40 years stands open now every summer evening with a warm light in the window. And somewhere in the booth an old man and the daughter who stayed run the reels their father kept, and that, in the end, was worth more than all the money the corner was ever going to bring. The restored print came home in October, the autumn after we reopened. Teresa Lim's archive had spent the better part of a year on it, working frame by frame, repairing the damage that 40 years in a steel cabinet does even a film a man tried to keep safe. The picture was a small one from 1955, a romance nobody remembered, the kind of second feature that played the Comet screen the summer my grandfather was young and never thought to call worth saving. The studio that made it had lost every copy to a vault fire in the 60s. Ours was the last one left on Earth. And now it was whole again, and the archive wanted to show it where it had survived. They made an evening of it. A man flew out from the studio's preservation office in Los Angeles, a polite young fellow who landed in Columbus and drove the last hour himself. And he stood in our field at dusk and told 400 carloads of Harmon, Ohio, that the film they were about to see existed because one drive-in owner in the middle of the country had bought a print in 1955, run it, and then kept it 40 years past the day anyone else on the continent would have thrown it out. He said the word irreplaceable, and he said my grandfather's name, Walter Vaughn, and the field leaned on its horns the way it had on opening night, that whole flock taking off at once. And the studio man laughed and said that in 20 years of his work nobody had ever honked at him, and he hoped he never got over it. Teresa had a small brass plaque made for the snack bar. It hangs by the popcorn machine now, where the kids who work the counter lean against it, without ever reading it. It gives Walt's dates and a line about the booth being one of the last intact collections of its kind. And under his name it says, because I asked to put it there, that he only thought he was a fellow who painted the sign. The studio man read it on his way out and asked who wrote that. I told him my grandfather did, more or less, and left it at that. Dale told me the truth of 1985 in November, after the leaves were down. He had taken to staying late on some nights, helping Sal fold the chairs, and I came across him one evening sitting alone in the dark field with a screen blank above him and a thermos at his feet, and I sat down beside it without being asked, because I had learned that much from my mother. He did not look at me when he started. He said that the summer his mother was dying she called him every Sunday, and she had never once asked him to come home, because she was too proud, and because she knew what the asking would cost her if he said no. He said he heard, her getting smaller on the telephone week by week, and he kept telling himself there would be time, that the deal would close, and then there would be time, and the deal closed on a Thursday, and his mother died the following Monday, and there had never been any time at all. There had only been the lie he told himself to keep from driving down that road. He said he stood at the edge of the cemetery in a suit he had bought for closings and could not make his legs carry him up to the grave, because if he walked up to it, he would have to admit out loud that he had chosen an office park over the last 5 months of his mother's life. And at 34, he was not man enough to admit that. So he got back in his car. His father did not call him after that. And he did not call his father. And the silence became a wall. And the wall stood for 11 years. By the time it came down, they were both old, with nothing left to do about any of it but be sorry. I came back here the first time, meaning to bury all of it under money, he said. Sell the corner, split the cash, never have to look at this field again. I told myself that was a kindness to you and Gil. He turned the thermos in his hands and did not drink from it. Your grandfather sat up in that booth dying and built a film to forgive me with, and I drove out here to take the ground out from under it. That's who I was, Frankie. I'd like to be somebody else before I'm finished. He still comes most Fridays. He sits near the front. He paid to have the Byrne County records rebuilt and asked for nothing. And once a season he writes a check to Teresa's archive that I am not supposed to know about. And that is what being sorry looks like on a man who spent his whole life knowing the worth of a corner and learned 40 years too late the worth of a field. Sal Farrow died in the spring of our second season. In his sleep, in the trailer across the road, 83 years old. He had run the second projector the Friday before and napped in the booth between reels the way he always did. And my father went up to wake him for the second feature and found him in the chair and could not. We closed the Comet for one night, the only dark night we have had since we opened the door, and then we threw the gate wide and let the whole town into the field for free. My father threaded the clean simplex by hand and rammed the real Mark Comet. Last good summer, 1984, the one with the ramps full of cars and the speakers still on the poles. About 2 minutes into it, if you know where to look, a young man with dark hair leans out the booth window and waves at the camera, grinning, the light off the field bright on his face. That was Sal at 40. My father stopped the reel on that frame and held it there, Sal's young face 60 feet tall in the dark, and the whole town sat and looked at him, and nobody touched a horn. Then my father let the film run on, because that is what you do. You let it run on. Sal left the booth tools to my father, and Will Harlan Pruitt wrote for him for free. There was one request in it. In Sal's own words, that somebody teach the next one. So I taught the next one. Her name is Carmen Reyes, and she is 17, and she came to the Comet 2 summers back to sell popcorn and would not stay out of the booth, the way some people simply cannot. My father watched her hang around the machines for a season the way my grandfather once watched a skinny boy named Gil Hatcher hang around them, and he did not chase her off any more than Walt chased off my father. She can thread the digital projector half asleep now, and she is learning the old simplex from my father with the same impatience he must have carried at her age. Last Friday, I stood at the back of the booth and watched her run a whole show start to finish while my father dozed in Walt's chair behind her, and I understood that the light had gotten into her the way it never once got into Dale, and that the Comet was going to outlast every one of us after all. I never went back to the city. I let the apartment go, and I let the man go too, gently, because he was a good man who wanted a different life than the one I had found in a dark field in Ohio, and there was no betrayal in it. Only two roads that did not run to the same place. I live in a house on Sumner Street now, my mother's house, with the small dresser and the spotted mirror and the empty cigar box. Empty because the brass key lives up in the booth where it always should have lived. I keep the Comet's books the way my grandmother Ruth kept them, in her style of columns, which I taught myself out of the old ledgers. Some nights I think she would approve of the figures, and some nights I think she would tell me I had priced the popcorn too low, and either way I feel her standing at my shoulder. My father is 71 now. He cannot take the booth stairs the way he used to, and on the bad nights Carmen runs the show and he sits out in the field with the rest of the town, which I have come to suspect he prefers, watching the light come across the dark from the side that fills with cars. But on the good nights, he still climbs up the room where Ruth used to sit with her thermos. He puts on her reading glasses, the ones with a lens that was cracked clean across, which he carried to a man in Columbus who fitted them with new glass, so he could actually wear them. He threads a gate by hand. And before every feature, every weekend, all season long, he runs one reel of his father-in-law's life across the screen, so the field never forgets whose ground it is parked on. There's a warm light in the booth window every summer night now, the way there must have been every night before 1985, the way Ruth would have known it from the snack bar when she glanced up from a register. The door my grandfather sealed against his own grief stands open. The films he could not stand to show a single living soul play on the largest screen in the county for anyone who comes up Route 9 and turns in at the gate. And the thing he hid up there for 40 years was never the deed, although the deed was up there. It was never the lost film, although that was up there too. What he hid up there was himself, his whole heart, sealed in cans in the dark, waiting on whoever loved the place enough to finally turn the key. My mother could not do it. My uncle would not. My father and I did, on a rusted iron landing at dusk with a flashlight pointed up at us from the gravel. And every good thing in my life, since it's come down out of that one turn lock and the warm light it let back into the window. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.